Oops, I didn't set it up. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on H.R. 2532, the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman, the ranking minority member, the vice chair, and the vice-ranking member. This will allow us to hear from other witnesses sooner and to help members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'd like to take a moment to welcome everyone to this hearing where we'll be discussing much-needed legislation, the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act put forward by the chairman of this committee, Chairman Grijalva. This is an issue that is especially important to me, so I would like to thank Subcommittee Chairman Huffman for letting me chair the hearing today. I'd also like to especially thank our witnesses, among them leaders in tribal governance and spiritual matters. Your perspective on this issue deserves the utmost attention, and we are so happy that you could join us here today. This subcommittee, as many of you in the audience may know, covers wildlife issues, endangered species, and ecosystems, but what is easy to forget is just how connected people are linked to wildlife issues. And so I commend Chairman Grijalva for making environmental justice and the threat of climate change on our natural world a top priority for this committee by ensuring that our natural resources are protected for all people. In today's hearing, we'll be focusing on an issue that has brought more Native American tribes together on a treaty than ever before, the grizzly bear. This bear is held sacred by scores of Native American tribes across the country. In fact, over 170 tribes have signed the Grizzly Treaty, a treaty of cooperation, cultural revitalization, and restoration in support of conservation measures for the grizzly bear, which is the foundation for this bill. Unfortunately, it comes as no surprise that recent attempts by this administration to remove protections for the grizzly, as well as blatant disregard for proper tribal consultation, would warrant this subcommittee's attention. It's estimated that at one time, over 50,000 grizzly bears roamed the continental United States. Now, that number is just around 1,500, with about 700 of those residing in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In 2017, the Trump administration removed Yellowstone grizzly bears from the federal list of threatened species. Following that decision, the states of Wyoming and Idaho proposed a trophy hunting season for grizzly bears in their respective states. The proposal would have allowed hunters in those states to kill bears just outside of Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. The Native American tribes sued, and they weren't the only ones. The decision to delist the grizzly bear was contested by nearly 30 plaintiffs, including Native American tribes, environmental groups, and individuals. Luckily, last September, a federal judge ruled that the decision to delist the grizzly bear was erroneous. But both the federal government and the state of Wyoming have appealed that decision, so we are, of course, still in the midst of that litigation. While these decisions are making their way through the courts, the fact is that we are dealing with an administration that places the interest of trophy hunters and the industries above those of Native Americans and their heritage, and which ultimately refuses to properly consult Native American tribes, a point that was made by my distinguished colleague, Representative Howland, earlier today before the Interior Secretary during his testimony before this committee. The legislation put forward by Mr. Grijalva is modeled after the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act that Congress protected bald eagles even after these species had recovered biologically under the ESA. Because of the symbolism to the American West and the importance of so many tribal nations, the grizzly bear deserves similar protection. In my view, H.R. 2532 balances the management of this incredible species with proper consultation with tribes. It sets strong conservation standards for grizzly bears and their habitat, bans trophy hunting in the lower 48 states, and permits the taking of grizzly bears under only a narrow set of circumstances. The bill also requires that conservation and management of the species be conducted in close consultation with federally recognized Native American tribes. Let's make this a priority for this subcommittee, the way that Native Americans have shown it's a priority for them by unifying around this issue through the Grizzly Treaty. I really do believe we have an opportunity today to right some wrongs, and I think this bill is a great start. And so with that, I am certainly looking forward to the hearing, to hearing what our tribal leaders and scientists have to say on this matter, and I will now turn it over to our distinguished ranking member for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd ask unanimous consent to allow Congresswoman Cheney and Congressman Gianforte to participate in today's hearing.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee meets today to consider H.R. 2532 by Congressman Grijalva. The bill would override the provisions of the Endangered Species Act and apply permanent regulatory restrictions to the management of grizzly bear populations, perpetuating federal control of wildlife management decisions that are traditionally and effectively managed by state authorities, even after a listed species has recovered its population to sustainable levels. Although the Endangered Species Act has been spectacularly unsuccessful at recovering 98% of the species under its provisions, there have been a few happy exceptions, one of which is the grizzly bear population. As we will hear from the director of the Wyoming Department of Game and Fish, the grizzly bear population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem has recovered from 136 bears in the early 1970s to more than 700 today. This is above the estimated carrying capacity of the conservation area, and it meets or exceeds all of the ESA criteria for delisting. This has been in part due to extraordinary efforts by Wyoming state officials to augment and facilitate federal efforts, enlisting the cooperation of landowners, local communities, and the general public. A major motivation for the state to do so has been the promise that traditional state prerogatives over managing the ecosystem will be restored once the endangered species population is recovered. According to the United States Geological Survey, the range of the Yellowstone grizzly has quadrupled since being listed under the ESA, currently occupying more than 25,000 square miles of habitat. The expanding population now risks overwhelming the resources of the habitat, forcing the growing population into a wider range that brings them increasingly into contact with human populations, sometimes with deadly consequences, both for humans and for the bears themselves. Under the provisions of the ESA, the grizzly bear no longer meets the definition of threatened and should be delisted. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have proposed doing so, but have been repeatedly thwarted by political agitation and litigation. In fact, delisting was first proposed by the Director of Fish and Wildlife, Dan Ash, under the Obama administration. State wildlife managers have proven to be able stewards for the preservation and perpetuation of other bear and wildlife populations within their jurisdictions, which have produced healthy populations at levels that the habitat can support. Now, we're often assured that the Endangered Species Act is entirely science-based. Well, the science tells us that the population is fully recovered with numbers well above those needed to assure genetic diversity, and that the population is now expanding at a steady rate. It is also warning us that the population is exceeding the ability of the land to support it. But this bill ignores this science because of decidedly unscientific ideological aversion to hunting. Yet if a sustainable, healthy species population is desired, tightly regulated hunting is highly preferable to nature's way of dealing with population control, which is disease, starvation, and encroachment into other habitats. Worse, as we'll hear in testimony, this bill imposes provisions that make species relocation all but impossible, foreclosing the opportunity of transferring grizzly bears from overpopulated habitats to underpopulated ones. The Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation warns that the credibility of the Endangered Species Act is dependent upon the successful transfer of wildlife management authority to state fish and wildlife agencies upon recovery. This legislation directly undermines state wildlife managers and sound science and breaks the promise that species management will be restored to state wildlife managers, local communities, and private landowners once its criteria for recovery are fulfilled, a promise that is essential to assure continued cooperation while a species is listed. Most of all, this bill places humans in increasing danger of injury and death as grizzly bear populations are pushed into foraging farms, ranges, parks, campgrounds, and ultimately rural towns by the excesses of this legislation. One would hope that the supporters of this bill would gladly seize this very rare success of species recovery under the ESA and declare victory. Instead, they ignore the scientific threshold set by the ESA and add permanent restrictions to grizzly bear management regardless of the size of the population and its effect on both the species and its habitat. This bill recognizes no scientifically supported population limits for the habitats affected, which in effect condemns the grizzly bear and its habitat to morbid overpopulation. This bill substitutes emotional, ideological, and sentimental biases that are the polar opposite of scientific resource management. It does, however, illustrate two of Ronald Reagan's famous principles. First, that there is nothing as permanent as a temporary government program, and that the 9 most terrifying words in the human language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I yield back.
Before introducing the witnesses, I would ask for unanimous consent to enter to the record a letter dated April 21st, 2017, from Representatives Mullen and Representative Cole to then Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Zinke, urging the Secretary to honor the mandatory predecision and meaningful government-to-government consultation with tribes when considering the delisting of the grizzly bear from the Endangered Species Act. As you will see in reviewing the letter, it cites numerous tribes that had contacted them about the Fish and Wildlife Service's lack of cooperation and the resulting petitions. Hearing no objection, it will be entered into the record. With that, I will now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Ben Nuvasmi, I pronounced it well, leader of the Hopi Bear Clan and former chairman of the Hopi tribe. He comes to us today from the village of Shungopavi, Arizona. Thank you. Then we will have Mr. Tom Rogers of the Blackfeet Nation, representing the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council. Following him will be Ms. Lynette Graybull, who is the Senior Vice President of the Global Indigenous Council and spokesperson for the Northern Arapaho Elders Society of the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. Next, we will hear testimony from Dr. Barry Gilbert, who is a conservation ecologist and professor emeritus of Utah State University. Following that, we will hear from Mr. Brian Nesvik, the director at the Wyoming Fish and Game Department. And then finally, we'll have Mr. Jonathan Wood, who is a senior attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation and a research fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, you'll see the yellow light come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I also will allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. And so with that, the chair would now recognize Mr. Ben Nuvasmi to testify.
Thank you, Honorable Chairman and honorable members of the subcommittee. My name is Benjamin Nuvamsa. I'm a member of the Hopi Tribe of Arizona and a member of the Hopi Bear Clan from the sovereign village of Shungopavi on Second Mesa. I am also a former chairman of the Hopi Tribe. I'm honored and humbled to come before you today as an elder of the Bear Clan and a practitioner of our traditional ceremonies, to explain the importance of the grizzly bear to the culture, the traditions, and lifeways of the Native people of the United States and Canada. I also come before you in support of the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act. A law, when passed, will provide permanent protection for our uncle, the grizzly bear. The grizzly bear, Honau, as we call him, is held in high esteem not only in our Hopi culture, but by other Native people in the United States and Canada. He's a healer and a medicine man. He plays a central role in the traditions, ceremonies, and the sovereignty of the Native people. I do not recall if there is one Native tribe that does not hold the bear in high regard. It was the most powerful of bears that guided and protected my ancestors to arrive at Duwanasavi, the center of the universe, as we call the place where we live today. The bear, from which my ancestors took their name, gave rise to other important clans at Hopi. Today, the Bear Clan continues as traditional leaders and an influential clan in the Hopi culture and Hopi way of life. During the pre-contact period, much of the ancestral Hopi lands was inhabited by grizzly bears. So from a Hopi perspective, Hopi land, Hopi culture, Hopi religion are inseparable, and it is that connection which defines Hopititsqua, Hopi lands, and Hopi Katsi, Hopi way of life. Other tribes have the same teachings and beliefs. In a biological sense, the grizzly bear, as a wildlife species, plays an important role in the ecological chain and thus contributes immensely to the ecological balance. To remove the grizzly bear from the ecology would have devastating effect on other wildlife species in the region. These species depend on each other for survival. That is why this bill is so important, that it will not only provide protections for the grizzly bear, but it will also provide protections for other wildlife species in the region. The Yellowstone National Park is one of the last remaining vestiges of natural beauty in America, and with unmatched beauty and a variety of wildlife. This is critical habitat for the grizzly bear and other wildlife species. At one time, the grizzly bear and other wildlife species inhabited our ancestral lands. But for many decades now, our lands and our people have been denied the experience of knowing the grizzly bear because of the pressures of overpopulation in its habitat and pressures from sports hunting and ranching. There is a reason why there is a Threatened and Endangered Species Act and why the grizzly bear was placed on the Threatened and Endangered Species list. Had it not been for this listing, the grizzly would just have been another species that has now become extinct. I propose that representatives of Indian country be involved in the policy development and implementation of the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act. I encourage that tribal nations, as sovereign nations, be afforded full and meaningful consultation as you set about to shape how this bill will be implemented. Our people have traditional and scientific knowledge about nature and all living things, that their participation would be invaluable. This is our sovereign right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm humbled and honored to have this opportunity to present to you and your committee why the grizzly bear is so important, not only to the native peoples of this great continent, but to all peoples of the United States, the people of other countries. I'm available to, should you have any questions. Kwakwa, thank you. Kwakwa, by lolo mani, let everything be good.
Thank you, sir. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tom Rogers to testify.
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and honorable members of the committee, my name is Tom Rogers. I'm a senior advisor to the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council. I'm an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe in the heart of Grizzly Bear Nation, the crown of the continent. I would like to note at the outset to this committee that true education is not seeing new things, it's seeing with new eyes. The Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council serves tribal nations located in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Alberta, who all called the Yellowstone and Glacier regions home before they were parks. From then until now, the grizzly has been ever present, albeit tenuously. There is no soundbite that can communicate the importance of the grizzly in our cultures, but that our ancestors wouldn't say the name of the grizzly out of respect speaks to the Great Bear's cultural significance. This is not emotional. This is not psychological. It is time that the tribal nations had input and parity in decisions that will determine the future survival of our sacred ancestor, the grizzly bear. The Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act provides that opportunity and the promise of cultural and economic revitalization for the tribes who hold a fundamental connection to the grizzly and the habitat that the grizzly once imbued with the power before being taken to the brink of extinction by states and federal policies imposed upon our lands. For my own people, the Blackfeet, the grizzly bear is associated with our thunder pipe bundles. As I speak, one of our most holy places, the Badger 2 Medicine, is under threat once again from the extractive industry after Secretary of Interior Bernhardt reversed interior policy to now allow oil leases there. A principal reason why the Badger 2 Medicine is secret to our people is the grizzly. During the grizzly delisting process, Interior failed to answer tribes' questions about the influence of multinational extractive industries on grizzly delisting, from the likes of Amick Foster Wheeler to potential conflict of interest involving the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, regional director related to the Anadarko Petroleum and Gas. To that end, I submit, for the record, joint testimony of some 30 tribes that was made to the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee dated October 20th, 2018. As I have just stated, it has always been about taking of our land and everything within it. Greater Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem is comprised of the ancestral and tree lands of all member tribes of the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council. For our tribes, those areas of the matrix of sacred and cultural sites
Time does not allow me to elaborate, so I submit for the record a document compiled by Northern Cheyenne Sundance priest Don Shoulderblade and Cornell and Harvard anthropology alumni Winfield Coleman, entitled Almost Ancestors, that speaks to the immense significance of the Grizzly in Cheyenne culture. You can replicate that for many of our tribes. The Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council was among the first major tribal bodies to oppose the delisting and the trophy hunting of the grizzly bear in the greater Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem by resolution. On December 14, 2014, representatives of all Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders tribes signed the historic treaty, the Grizzly, a treaty of cooperation, cultural revitalization, and restoration. Now the most signed treaty in the history of our 200 nation signatories. Central to the treaty and the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act are the Grizzly Reintroduction Articles. Instead of trophy hunting the grizzly, tribal nations advocate relocating grizzlies from the greater Yellowstone and NCD Northern Corridor to ecosystem to sovereign tribal lands in the grizzly's historic range, where biologically suitable habitat exists among the tribes to explore and participate in such a program. This plan provides for cultural and economic environmental revitalization for participating tribal nations, as outlined by a multitude of tribes. Returning the grizzly bear to participating tribal nations could be an economic lifeline to communities burdened by unemployment rates that routinely exceed 50% and above. On my reservation, it's 80%. From ecotourism plans centered upon grizzly reintroductions similar to those already successfully operated by the First Nations in British Columbia, to vocational opportunity for tribal members in the field of grizzly biology and management. Tribal grizzly management plans would reflect each tribe's cultural and economic imperatives and be grounded in traditional ecological knowledge. A July 2014 study in the Journal of Environmental Management magazine found that 99% of tourists traveling to Yellowstone and Grand Teton want to see a grizzly. 99%, not trophy hunting. A previous USDA Forest Service study, Insights into the Economic Value of Grizzly Bears in the Yellowstone Recovery Zone, provided analysis of how valuable grizzlies are to Yellowstone gateway economies, which was subsequently supported by the economies of roadside bear viewing. Since 2012, out-of-state visitors above to Yellowstone have spent $398 million annually in the area. In 2017, visitors to Yellowstone National Park provided $499 million to gateway communities.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Lynette Gray Bull to testify.
Mr. Chairman and honorable members, my name is Lynette Grable. My traditional name is Morning Water. I am a Senior Vice President of the Global Indigenous Council and a spokesperson for the Northern Arapaho Elder Society of the Wind River Indian Reservation, located in Grizzly Country in Wyoming. The grizzly bear is integral to the cultural and spiritual practices of the Northern Arapaho people. Our elders teach how the grizzly bear brought us to our medicines. Grizzlies know what about roots and herbs for physical healing, but also about healing mental conditions. They say in socioeconomic bondage that we survive in, our reservation communities need the healing more than ever today. The grizzly bear isn't a trophy game animal. The grizzly is our relative, a grandparent. The frontier mentality practice of trophy hunting our relative is apparent to us, and in no way reflects the best available science precepts of the ESA. The terms we use for grizzly bears are the same as we use for people. In the long struggle to protect the grizzly and in turn our sacred ancestral lands that the grizzly protects for us, we defended our sovereignty from state and federal intrusion. We defended our treaty rights. We fought flagrant abuses of conservation mandates, and we defend our spiritual and religious freedoms. The Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act reflects those essentials inspired as it was by the historical treaty, the Grizzly, a treaty of cooperation, cultural revitalization, and restoration, to which our Northern Arapaho elders and spiritual leaders were signatories. Both in the Northern Arapaho Elder Society and the Northern Arapaho Business Council submitted numerous documents to federal and multi-jurisdiction authorities opposing grizzly delisting and trophy hunting in the greater Yellowstone region. Regardless of whether we sent letters, made statements, or presented sworn affidavits, none of those submissions of our concerns were addressed. I hereby enter into the record two of those documents, a letter from the Northern Arapaho Business Council dated October 18, 2016, that was a cease and desist sent to Interior regarding persistent misrepresentations of the Northern Arapaho Tribe's position on delisting, and also an affidavit dated June 29, 2016, from the Northern Arapaho Elder Society that catalogs the range of abuses suffered by the Northern Arapaho during the delisting process. Our records were among those who felt vulnerable at the delisting contention grew, which was due to the hostility that was generated towards our people at Integrity and State Grizzly Bear meetings in Wyoming. The media reported on this. The few who tried to attend and contribute share their experiences. For the record, I entered an email to the USFWS Director Dan Ash, which cites some of these instances. The blueprint for grizzly bear management is the Grizzly, a treaty of cooperation, cultural revitalization, and restoration upon the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act is based. Our people are not lacking in knowledge or ability to manage our own lands and endangered species. What we lack is the funding to implement programs to do so. In 2019, it should not be necessary to state the paternalistic attitude toward tribes by some agencies, the federal government, and states. The Grizzly Reintroduction Plan, in the heart of the treaty and Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act, provides for cultural and environmental revitalization for participating tribes. To communicate the significance of the grizzly bear to tribal nations across Indian country, I would like to view this short film called Not in Our Name that features the Northern Arapaho elders and was directed by my brother Rain. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do shiji pikat da saunda.
Charge ukit kapi ompisni.
No en nuestro nombre.
Not in our name.
Do bana sidzinda denene kliniki. Bana ikse ja umi.
Not in our name.
Doya bia wirikan ge biakan. Doya bia akwan ge biakan.
Kaitamangan, not for us. Kaitamusve, not because of us.
Not in my name.
Natapinska Simenyu.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. Barry Gilbert to testify.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, subcommittee members, and attendees. I'm grateful and honored to present information in support of grizzly bear conservation. Thank you. I'm a senior scientist retired from Utah State University, Department of College of Natural Resources, where I taught wildlife science, wildlife management, animal behavior, and particularly conflicts between wildlife and humans. I've specialized on grizzly bears and some black bear work, as well as polar bears, for the last 45 years, and tried my bid at wrestling grizzly bears 40 years ago, and I lost. In conservation biology, I examine how large mammals and their habitat are affected by interactions with humans. Most of this work is focused on grizzly bears in the Rockies, Alaska, and coastal British Columbia. And I've just recently sent a book into press, so grizzly bears have been much on my mind in the last little while. In addition to my recent work, written work, I have been invited by the Forest Service to lecture on carnivore habitat management And I was invited on a task panel in Yellowstone Park by the superintendent to look at management along streams in that area. I have spent a huge amount of time up close with grizzly bears. I do observational work, and most of the bears are within 50 to 350 feet from us in trees. So I contend that I know a great deal about the behavior of bears, finally. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem provides critically important habitat for grizzly bears, and I'd like to specify a little bit about Yellowstone because there's misinformation and misinterpretation about the so-called carrying capacity. The 4 major sources of food for grizzly bears have been degraded in Yellowstone. Cutthroat trout, whitebark pine seeds, elk have gone from something like 7,500 to 2,500. And this accounts, I believe, for much of the reason that bears are extending out beyond the conservation zone. The interpretation that they've overfilled their habitat or exceeded the carrying capacity of the habitat is because the carrying capacity has been degraded, often by both global warming and human introduction of lake trout. The reason I emphasize that because Yellowstone is one of the 2 major areas for bears in large numbers. The Northern Continental Divide and the Cascade and Yellowstone are the 2 main ones. The Cascade often appears in some of the maps as a huge area up against British Columbia, but it's no bears have been found there. So, and the Yak area in northwestern Montana only has 25 bears, and the government is now trying to put the Pacific Northwest Trail through the core critical habitat of those bears in the Yak system. In the document I presented, I went into the distribution of the impacts of grizzly bear populations in Wyoming and Idaho. When there was a hunting season presented, Wyoming was going to release, put up 25 permits. And although some people consider, I'm not anti-hunting, but the American people express a value against trophy hunting, as with the native cultures. And so this is not feeble-mindedness on the part of people or ideology, it's a value system. And much of, as with the bald eagle, we don't hunt bald eagles, but there are plenty of them. It's a value judgment that we have. And I think the science supports this bill. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions later from any of you.
Thank you, Doctor. The chair now recognizes Mr. Brian Nesvik to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I'm Brian Nesvik, the Director of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here today to provide some perspectives on the bill in front of the committee. The testimony provided herein is based on my experience and knowledge of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, population of grizzly bears, and I'll refer to them throughout my testimony as the GYE. I have extensive experience working in the field in areas occupied by grizzly bears, as well as experience capturing and handling grizzly bears, and I've had several years of experience now working on policy related to grizzly bear management. I've served on the Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, and I've chaired that committee as well. Well, if passed, this particular piece of draft legislation would be relevant to all populations in the lower 48. And this testimony is going to focus on the GYE population. Many of the impacts on grizzly bear management described may be relevant to other populations. The successful recovery of the GYE population is one of the most significant conservation success stories in the history of wildlife conservation, and Wyoming is proud to have taken a leadership role in grizzly bear recovery and management for the past 40 years. Wyoming people, primarily those who purchased hunting and fishing licenses, have invested over $50 million to recover this population from their low point in the early 1970s. Wyoming people have changed the way they work, the way they live and recreate in grizzly bear country to help with this recovery. Now the most conservative estimates show there are over 700 grizzly bears in the GYE, and the population is fully recovered as measured by all federally developed recovery criteria, and it has exceeded those recovery criteria since 2003. While the majority of GYE grizzly bears in suitable habitat are in Wyoming, there are also significant portions of the population in Montana and Idaho and on the Wind River Reservation. These states and tribes have also demonstrated strong commitment by contributing significantly to the recovery of the population. All 3 states and tribes and the 2 tribes have developed grizzly bear management plans. The GYE population has expanded in size and distribution throughout its recovery and now occupies habitats far outside the original recovery area. This expansion in range into unsuitable habitats has created significant challenges for all states involved because of the ever-increasing rise in human-bear conflicts. Dangerous encounters with humans, destruction of private property, mostly livestock, and bear occupancy in human-dominated landscapes are all the reality of an expanding population. Despite grizzly bear mortality due to self-defense take and agency removal, the population continues to grow and expand. States and tribes, the people closest to this treasured resource, need to have the ability to manage the population in the best interest of bears and people based on science. Leadership and management efforts by the states are the primary reason this population has recovered, and the states and tribes need to have flexibility and diverse sets of tools to manage for a viable population and handle the growing number of conflicts. The states and tribes have a proven track record of managing grizzly bears in this population, and as this population was recently under state and tribal management twice in the recent past, and only recently returned to a listed status based on a court decision in September of 2018. The judge in this case did not cite a lack of recovered status as a reason for relisting. The states have a long and successful record of managing other species of large carnivores, including black bears, mountain lions, and gray wolves, and these species thrive today under state management. Additional federal oversight committees, prohibitions against hunting, and federal management of a recovered and delisted population, as is proposed in this bill, do not work towards meeting the needs of the people on the ground, doing the work every day to ensure the viability and health of this population. I know this because today we are doing the on-the-ground work. It is state managers who are responding to conflicts, flying dangerous high mountain surveys, and providing education to people working, living, and recreating in bear country. They do this not because they have to, but because they're under a federal status, but they do it voluntarily because they care about managing a highly valued species of wildlife within their state's borders. The burdens of paying $2 million per year, along with the complexity of operating under unnecessary federal requirements, weigh heavily on decision makers. Furthering federal oversight and non-science-based protections are a disincentive for states to continue to do the hard work that has brought the population to its current recovered and healthy status. I appreciate this opportunity to share my perspectives and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Jonathan Wood for his testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and honorable members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to address H.R. 2532 and how Congress can best promote the grizzlies' continued recovery. I'm a senior attorney with Pacific Legal Foundation, where I litigate environmental cases, principally concerning endangered species. I'm also a research fellow with the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana, where they experience firsthand both the benefits and costs of an expanding grizzly population. I'll preface my remarks by noting that the greater Yellowstone ecosystem grizzlies recovery and delisting should be a cause of celebration for all of us who care about this iconic species. A recovery is an unfortunately rare event under the Endangered Species Act, and too often those recoveries are portrayed negatively, focusing on the change in federal regulation rather than the change in the species' prospects. But our ultimate goal for every endangered and threatened species is and should be that species recovery. The Yellowstone grizzlies recovery, which the president of the National Wildlife Federation described as, quote, a true American conservation success story, was a result of extensive collaboration between federal biologists, state wildlife officials, conservation groups, and landowners. Such collaborations depend on having the right incentives and are the key to recovering more grizzly populations and other species. It is from that perspective that I caution against passing H.R. 2532 in its current form. The Yellowstone grizzlies recovery was motivated in significant part by the promise of a return to state management. The simple fact is that the Endangered Species Act's primary incentives for recovery efforts are the promise of more flexible state management upon delisting and regulatory relief for landowners who provide habitat. Sections 3 and 5 significantly undermine these incentives for this species, and they set a harmful precedent for other species across the country. These provisions, which broadly prohibit take and limit the circumstances where a permit may be granted, would effectively retract state authority over wildlife and dictate federal management in perpetuity, giving states, federal agencies, and tribes even less flexibility over recovered grizzly populations than they enjoy for those listed under the Endangered Species Act. These provisions would effectively deter efforts to recover grizzly and other wildlife by depriving the states and their citizens of any reward for that effort. They would also erect a significant obstacle to future grizzly reintroduction. Consider, for instance, the effort to return grizzly to the Bitterroot ecosystem. In the 1990s, the National Wildlife Federation and Defenders of Wildlife, working with loggers and others, developed a compromise plan to reintroduce grizzly into this important habitat. According to NWF's Hank Fisher, the biggest obstacle was not fear of the grizzly, but the federal regulations that would accompany any reintroduced grizzlies. Unfortunately, some environmentalists attacked the compromise they negotiated, demanding strict federal regulation of any reintroduced grizzlies, which in turn caused the state to oppose the plan. As a result, no grizzlies were reintroduced. H.R. 2532 in its current form would require the same strict regulations apply to any reintroduced populations, while denying federal agencies, tribes, states, and everyone else the flexibility needed to develop similar compromises like that which almost restored grizzly to the Bitterroot. Ultimately, states and tribes should take the lead on managing recovered wildlife populations, including the Yellowstone grizzly. That said, there is much Congress can do to support these efforts and incentivize similar recoveries of other populations. For instance, Section 6 of the bill aims to reduce the extent to which the grizzly is a liability for landowners by compensating them for lost livestock, but you should aim higher. Rather than reducing the extent of liability, make grizzlies an asset for states and tribes, as well as landowners. For instance, Congress could incentivize states and tribes to make grizzlies available for relocation or reintroduction as an alternative to less palatable forms of take. In my written testimony, I described Utah's successful program to significantly boost the Utah prairie dog population by encouraging relocation as a preferred alternative to other forms of take. Congress should also strengthen the incentives for landowners to accommodate grizzly or protect habitat. In my written testimony, I described several efforts by conservation groups to achieve these incentives. I also discuss how Section 5F of this bill will undermine those efforts by making it more difficult for tribes and conservationists to negotiate with landowners. In conclusion, as Aldo Leopold said, conservation ultimately boils down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. The states and landowners who have contributed to the Yellowstone grizzly's recovery have conserved that public interest, and they should be rewarded. And unfortunately, this bill in its current form doesn't do that. But as I explained more fully in my written testimony, there's much Congress could do to reward these and other efforts, as well as to ensure that the incentives of states, tribes, conservationists, and landowners are best aligned with the interests of grizzly and other species. Thanks again for the invitation to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Wood, and for all of the witnesses. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chairman will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes of questions. My first question is for Dr. Gilbert. Doctor, thank you for appearing today. Grizzly bears, as you testified to, once roamed in huge numbers across the western United States, certainly in my home state of Colorado, but due to hunting and habitat destruction, they've been completely wiped out. In all of the lower 48 states, there are only roughly 1,500 grizzly bears left. In your expert scientific opinion, are those numbers high enough to remove protections for the grizzly bear, as the administration has done?
Would you repeat the last sentence? I'm a little hard of hearing.
That's all right. Do you believe, in your opinion, that the numbers that I mentioned, the fact that there are roughly 1,500 grizzly bears left in the United States in the lower 48, is that number high enough to justify the Trump administration's decision to delist the bear from protection under the Endangered Species Act?
The numbers are estimates, and they're valid. I think they're as good an estimate as you can get. My opinion would be, backed by the science, is that grizzly bears exist in less than 3% of their original numbers. And if grizzlies are to survive as a species genetically and in numbers, there has to be connectedness between the populations of bears. That's one thing that's often missed. The use of the term recovered may apply technically to the greater Yellowstone, but nationwide, I would not say that we've recovered the grizzly bear. When you have 25 bears in the Yak ecosystem, that's nearing the extinction slide. And if you look at the humpback whale, for example, they're estimated to be 2,500 to 3,500, and they're considered threatened at those numbers. So I put quotation marks around the term recovered. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor, and I would certainly agree with you. My understanding that British Columbia, just by way of example, has 20 times as many grizzlies as the state of Wyoming, and British Columbia just last year, I believe, decided to end the practice of trophy hunting. So I think it's regrettable that we have obviously a variety of others have made the decision that I think we should make. But in any event, I want to ask Mr. Nesvik you a question. There's, as I understand it, as an article I have from the National Geographic from last year around the lottery that the state of Wyoming attempted to institute prior to the federal decision, the decision from the federal court. And there were a number of people who attempted to essentially purchase licenses or be a part of the lottery to try to win the opportunity to be able to potentially engage in the hunt. But folks who felt like trophy hunting is a practice that we should eliminate, and so therefore they were doing so that they could instead take the slots. Am I understanding that right?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct.
And in that article, you're quoted as saying, quote, "This is more about taking away hunting opportunities than having an impact on our population management objective." Does that sound right? I can give you the article.
Sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is, based on that quote, was the state of Wyoming's attempted hunt, right, and this new program, or not new, but obviously a program that you tried to reinstitute after the delisting, was that based off of a population management objective, or was it based purely to give hunters in the state of Wyoming and others, because I understand that there's a ratio, I believe it's 1/4 of the hunters can come in from out of state. Was it simply to give folks an opportunity to be able to hunt grizzlies? Because that quote to me suggested it's the latter.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so the number that was established to use as a premise to allocate licenses was based on not exceeding a mortality threshold. And the mortality threshold is part of the established recovery criteria. And let's just say, as an example, that all of those licenses would have been allocated and everybody would have been successful. It would not have had an impact on the population. In other words, the population is large enough and has a sustainable level that it's mortality that probably would have happened anyway. And as an example, I would offer the fact that on an annual basis, far, far more bears than that are removed by agencies or by in self-defense take. So it was a number that was low enough that would ensure that the population would not change over time, or from that one hunting season.
All right, see, my time has expired, but I'd love to explore that issue with you further in terms of the projections about what happens when you go beyond year one with respect to the extent that this hunt would be permitted. So in any event, with that, I'll recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Nesvik, let's go beyond year one if this bill were to take effect. You have extensive experience with grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. What can we expect? How can we expect the population to progress if this bill took effect? Say, fast forward 50 years.
Sure, Mr. Ranking Member and Mr. Chairman, the grizzly bear management plan that's currently in place and approved in Wyoming dictates that on an annual basis, those numbers are reevaluated, new information, new data collection, new analysis is conducted on an annual basis.
Right, but if this bill were to take effect, Tell us what the grizzly population is going to look like in 50 years, and what
Okay.
habitat are they going to be extended over?
Apologize, Mr. Ranking Member, I didn't understand your question fully. So if this bill were to take effect, what we would see is a continued higher level of agency take even under federal protection, because grizzly bears will continue to move outside of the core of the recovery zone, the core biologically suitable habitat, and into areas where they're, in human-dominated landscapes. And
what in turn will that mean?
It would just mean a continued amount of take, of removal of grizzly bears from a population lethally by an agency and not through opportunity allocated in accordance with the North American model of wildlife conservation.
All right, we're told we need connectedness between the various grizzly populations. They already occupy 25,000 square miles of habitat. How much more do you think would be required in order to provide connectedness?
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, so the Yellowstone ecosystem is what I can speak with some authority on, and I can tell you that recent literature indicates that the level of, there's a prediction of the amount of inbreeding that occurs in a specific population, and that analysis, that research, that literature that was published indicated that the Yellowstone ecosystem with its current population could remain viable without being genetically connected to another population.
Okay, we're told that the population is insufficient to be genetically sustainable. That's not your view, apparently.
That's correct, Mr.
Is that the view established by the ESA? The Endangered Species Act provides a criteria for delisting. Is that analysis consistent with the ESA's provisions?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, the analysis that the Yellowstone does not need recovery or doesn't need connectivity is consistent with the interagency grizzly bear study team that informs the decision to delist, and so it was a part of that decision.
Have there been human fatalities due to grizzly encounters in recent years?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, unfortunately,
What's the trend on these fatalities? Are they going up, going down, stable?
Mr. Chairman, they're increasing.
Can we expect increasing rates of human fatalities under the provisions of this bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And can we expect bear fatalities increasing as a result of this bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
We've heard a lot of objections from the tribes, which appear to be religious and not scientific. I mean, the grizzly bear is our grandfather, is a religious observation, not a scientific one. The one exception, of course, is Dr. Gilbert's testimony. He testifies that exhaustion of food resources are causing territorial expansion of the grizzly. Do you agree?
Would I agree that there's been territorial expansion of the grizzly bear population?
No, that is being caused by exhaustion of food sources due to factors other than grizzly population.
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't agree. I believe that the interagency grizzly bear study team that really has responsibility for analyzing the Greater Yellowstone has indicated that they believe it has reached or has nearly reached density dependence or carrying capacity.
Well, I would think that if sources are disappearing for other reasons than population growth, that would affect population growth, would it not?
That's correct.
How would this bill affect the ability to relocate bears from overpopulated habitats to underpopulated ones?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I understand the current structure of the bill, it would require this Federal Oversight Committee to authorize those moves, and it would be basically there would be more process involved in being able to make that happen.
So it'd be harder to move grizzlies from overpopulated habitats to underpopulated ones under this bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Again, the moral, not scientific argument is that trophy hunting's morally objectionable. We heard it's politically unpopular. Does delisting open grizzly bears to indiscriminate slaughter?
No, Mr. Chairman.
How would permitting work?
So essentially, the licenses are allocated and folks are under very tight regulation, are required to follow rules and laws and report harvest and do it in an ethical manner.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Gianforte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the panel for being here today. Like many Montanans, I have a deep and abiding respect and appreciation for our environment. I believe we can promote conservation of our rich and diverse wildlife while also supporting multiple use of our lands. The two are not mutually exclusive. The grizzly bear is an example of a successful collaboration. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state wildlife officials, ranchers, and conservationists have helped the grizzly bear recover from a low of 136 bears to about 700 in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In my own discussions with biologists there, this population of 700 is about the maximum carrying capacity of that ecosystem. This expanded population has forced bears to spread far beyond their typical range, and as a result, we have increased conflicts and threats to people. 2 years ago, I spoke with community leaders in Stanford, Montana. In that community, 2 grizzly bears had recently killed dairy cows just a stone's throw from elementary school playground. These cows were mauled where little children play on the prairie. This was farther east than grizzlies had been seen in nearly 100 years. I recently heard from a Montanan in Shelby that bears were spotted on the local public golf course, and at this point, Montana's being innovative, have taken to firing a cannon every 10 minutes to scare the bears off the golf course. Folks in Valier, Montana, don't go out at night anymore because they're scared of encounters with bears in town. Whether it's near a playground or on a local public golf course, the increased exposure of grizzly bears to people is a serious threat and jeopardizes public safety. Along with Congresswoman Cheney, I'm proud sponsor of the Grizzly Bear State Management Act. This bill affirms the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's position that the grizzly bear is recovered in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It also returns management to the states and ends the protracted, unnecessary lawsuits that tie up effective management. Instead of continuing a federal management of a species that's already recovered, Mr. Wood, can you talk about what you see as the benefits of returning the grizzly bear management to the states like Montana?
Absolutely. The biggest one is that it rewards all of the effort that's been undertaken to date. It gives the states exactly what they've been working towards. I would prefer Congress focus on how we further increase the incentives for that kind of work so that more grizzly populations can experience the growth that the Yellowstone grizzly has. And unfortunately, this bill in its current form gets the incentives backwards.
Just as a follow-on, Mr. Wood, Montana has effectively managed the gray wolf population outside Yellowstone National Park. Do you think the state is capable of doing the same thing with the grizzly bear?
Absolutely. We often hear that if a species is delisted, states won't be up to the challenge, and the fact is there's absolutely no evidence to support that. Every species that has been delisted as recovered has been effectively managed by states, and there's never been a case where they had to be relisted because of backsliding.
Okay, well, thank you. And I agree with your position. We need to return management of the grizzly bear back. This is a conservational success. We should take credit, celebrate, and get control back to the states. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter of opposition to the proposed Fish and Wildlife Service rule to remove the ESA protections for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly bear, signed by 50 scientific experts. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following documents: a letter from the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, and the other from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the Public Lands Council, and the American Sheep Industry Association, all expressing opposition to this legislation.
Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony today, and certainly to the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and so we will ask you to respond to those questions in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business.
Mr. Chairman?
Who?
With all due respect, sir, I just wanted to alert the committee's attention to the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association. Unfortunately, representative could not be here today for medical reasons, but they represent the tribes of the Dakotas into Nebraska, and their resolution of opposition to the efforts of the state of Wyoming and their support for this legislation and their testimony. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that, and only for medical reasons she was not able to attend.
Thank you for making us aware of that, sir. And with unanimous consent, we will enter that resolution into the record as well. without objection.
Mr. Chair, really quickly, I also forgot to submit the Eastern Shoshone resolution opposing trophy hunting in the state of Wyoming from the Wind River Reservation as well. I wanted to make sure we get that into the record, sir.
Without objection, shall be entered into the record as well. If there's no further business of the committee, thank you again to the witnesses, and without objection, the committee will stand adjourned.